Hello. Teachers have spent a long time building up these band programs and music programs in many cases, years and years. And they're less interesting, I would assume, for students under the current circumstances. So they're also sort of coping with the possibility that this program they built over a decade, for example, is going to have much lower enrollment because the experience is just not there. But that in with other conditions in education, is there anything that you think elevates the risk for teachers in particular?
I mean, one of my thoughts would be, isolation. So for those teachers, I know it's a mishmash, and
Mhm.
some teachers are working from home, some are there in person, but sort of a sense of connection with colleagues decreases if you're not able to physically interact in ways that you might usually, in a lunchroom together, for example, or kind of debriefing, brainstorming with colleagues and peers. And I think you really hit on something in talking about how invested teachers can be, and it's fantastic, to putting that extra effort into building these programs, and the demoralization you must feel in seeing time go by, and again not knowing what's going to happen, or maybe seeing some attrition, and knowing that kids could really flourish with these kind of programs, and then seeing them not be able to join it. I think it's extremely difficult to be invested in something and then watch it wither under factors and conditions that aren't in your control.
It's a really interesting point you mentioned about isolation because just by its nature, teaching is a fairly isolated activity, as in I go close my door and do my thing with students, and I don't have a lot of adult interaction except at lunchtime or if I have a prep where I might go to the staff room just to do that, just to interact with others. And as you point out, that option is gone. So the isolation thing has probably been elevated. Any other thoughts on that point, Dr. Salas?
Yeah, I think first of all, I think your preamble really hit so many of the major reasons why teachers are vulnerable here. The other piece that you had sort of talked about before that I'll bring back is that idea of sort of being stuck in the middle of anxious populations around you, both from the youth and sort of being in this place of trying to manage that and deal with that, but then also sort of maybe those who are making decisions above you. And so teachers are sort of stuck in the middle there of trying to balance these things. And maybe the administrators, well, they're probably anxious too, but maybe at least they feel like, well, okay, we can make these decisions and we can sort of set the direction. And teachers are stuck trying to say, well, like, how am I supposed to put this in place? And how is this going to work for me? And so I think that's another potential reason.
And if I could jump in, another, there's sort of front line for parents. So we know particularly kids who may be dealing with anxiety, because anxiety runs in families. They may have anxious parents who are needing reassurance or wanting, or who may have strong opinions either way. But I think teachers really are at the front line there for all of those questions, concerns, complaints, what have you, rumors about who may be doing what, maybe breaking what COVID rule, and all of these types of things. They're there at the forefront dealing with this.
Times of working in psychology, and if I'm not functioning emotionally at my best, really struggling to share strategies and try to motivate people towards hope, because you're feeling like, well, I don't know if I have hope right now, or like I'm not coping or tolerating my anxiety really well right now, so how am I supposed to tell you to tolerate or cope with your anxiety?
Right.
And so I think, yeah, Judith hit it really well there, where if teachers are struggling, then trying to help their students struggle can then enhance that struggle.
And I think an important bias here to mention is called anchor or anchoring bias, which is this sense like you have a skewed view. So if you're in the middle of something and you don't see an end in sight, it can become easy to believe, well, this will never end. Like things are horrible and this is going to go on forever. And again, especially after you've gone through a number of months, so it can really lead to this bleak outlook, which is incorrect, right? But
Right.
it's this bias that can happen after you've been sort of worn down over time. And so the caregivers, i.e. the teachers, I think, are really susceptible to this sort of anchoring bias, this sense of like, we're going to be stuck in this limbo land forever, which is not true.
And I have a lot of teachers in my family, and another thing that's been introduced, particularly with the online version of teaching, which has happened periodically, I think, in every province throughout the year, is they have this issue with parents in the background on a Zoom call who are watching the lesson. Maybe you're not sure who's watching the lesson when you're teaching. In other words, you're not sure who's in the classroom. And teachers aren't used to that. I know some teachers would be nervous about it, but they'd be especially nervous about it when this is not a normal situation. This isn't their best teaching. This isn't, what they've been trained to do. And I think that sometimes the uncertainty of what's happening in the classroom, which might be the kitchen or a bedroom or whatever, has added another dimension to it. The demands of the current circumstances in schools and elsewhere, of course, are bound to raise anxiety and stress levels in most people. But what are some signs or symptoms in ourselves or in our colleagues that would suggest that what we're experiencing is beyond the realm of a normal response and may require health and support? Sort of how much anxiety or stress is too much? What symptoms can we look for there?
I mean, it's such a good question, because I think people are familiar with the concept that a little bit of stress can actually increase your productivity, a little bit of get up and go and motivate you to work harder at something and attend to it more. But then if you cross that line into more stress, the productivity or how well you're going to perform goes down over time. And then in the realm of mental health professions, I guess, in terms of defining like how much is too much, or when would we call it a disorder per se. It's really largely based around functioning. So if it's so much that you're not able to do the normal things that you do in life, or it's significantly impacted how you're able to be who you are, live your life at home, with family, with friends, at work, whether it's through Zoom or otherwise, if it's hit that point where it's significantly impacting your ability to kind of do the stuff that you do in your life, or if it's causing a lot of distress or taking big chunks of time out of your day, then that's kind of the point where we would start to consider whether we would call it a disorder, as opposed to just the usual, anxiety is an emotion. We know this. It's not necessarily bad or good. Stress can be positive, but really when it crosses the line into keeping people from doing what they want to do well and how they function in their life, that's when we would get involved and say maybe this is too much, or a disorder that we could look at treating.
Part of your question was when does it require help or support? And I would say that's partly a personal decision as well. Like when people feel like they need help or support, that might be a good time to reach out. And what that looks like might be different depending on how severe that distress is or how much it's getting in the way. But on the lowest level, it might be, hey, can you make time with your colleagues to make up for that lunch that you lost, and talk about how you're struggling and how you're managing and the questions you're getting from kids. And maybe that's sort of a low level of support that's enough for some people to cope with the increased anxiety and stress. And then going up from there in terms of formal resources, self-access ones like those from Anxiety Canada, sort of up to, trying to reach out and get therapy or direct service for yourself.
If I could jump in again, I think Dr. Seles really hit on something so important. Rather than waiting until you sort of hit this or cross this magic line, whatever that might be, there's a huge role for prevention, and self-care and so forth. So definitely learning those skills, the things Dr. Seles was talking about previously, about how do you cope with stress? Because, as you go through life, there's going to be stress. There's going to be things in your environment that are upsetting or out of your control, and uncertainty, even outside of COVID. And it's possible, definitely possible, to improve no matter what your natural inclination might be. you can work on it and develop skills to become better at coping with those, those waves that come along in life.
Right. And we're going to actually, in the next question, sort of maybe delve into some of those self-care strategies. One of the things which I don't need to tell you as mental health professionals, that's an obstacle to getting help or even admitting that you might need help or even noticing it possibly is the stigma that's been attached to mental health issues, which I think, we've finally awoken to this in the last few years. There's been an effort to sort of destigmatize it, and many people have been helpful in coming forward with their own mental health stories. But there's also a sort of a bit of, it's a tricky situation to approach a call. First of all, it's a tricky situation to say to myself. I think even though I've been a completely healthy individual all my life, now I think I'm struggling. But to know when to approach a colleague who's maybe exhibiting some behaviors that are unusual to you, and maybe a colleague you've known for many years or taught with. Do you have any suggestions around that? When to leap in and how?
Things you're saying are so poignant. I mean, it's really key because we're all human beings, all of us even here, and we know our colleagues are human beings too, and we can struggle. And what's a crying shame, I find, is if someone may have some physical health problems, there's not necessarily the stigma about, if they come in with crutches, you say, oh, how are you doing? What can I do to help? Tell me about this. How did this all happen? Without having a second thought of, oh, is it going to be embarrassing for them? But with mental health stigma, I think people might hold back a little bit and worry about embarrassing the person. And no one seeks out a mental illness. No one seeks out these kind of struggles. And yet there can still be a bit of this lingering sense of, well, it's your own fault, or you should suck it up, or you should be able to just sort it out yourself and just pull yourself together, which is not what you would say to someone if they broke their leg, for example. In those scenarios, okay, admit it. Yeah, I think there's something going on with my leg. You go in, you get care, not hiding it from people. You may need adaptations, a little time off of this or that, accepting the support of people around you so that you can get back to usual. And then it's such a contrast with emotional or mental illness struggles, because there is that secrecy. I think there's a lot of power in secrecy, because people might keep the suffering to themselves, feeling that they may be judged. But if it's a secret, they're never going to be able to test it. So it may well be that if they reach out to someone, that person may say, oh my goodness, I had this happen to me a number of years ago, and this is what happened, and you can do it. But if it's a secret, they can't find that out. Whereas if it's, someone who broke their leg, oh yeah, I remember I broke my leg, and this is a little tip, and this is what you do. And it's kind of sort of more out in the open.
To expand on that, I think the way that you can approach people is really through shared experience and validation and a non-judgmental lens. So it can be things like, man, this pandemic is really hard for me. How are you coping? Right? So starting with your own experience, and then you can get into sort of subtle recognitions. Hey, I noticed, if I think about when we were interacting last year, you were so excited about teaching, and I know this pandemic's been hard for me, and I noticed maybe you seem a little bit less interested these days. So it doesn't have to be like, do you have anxiety, or anything that might make people defensive? But if you're sort of coming from a space of, I want to listen and talk, and give people the chance to open up, that might segue a little bit easier than to saying like, well, how can I support you, or what things might you need, or that sort of thing.